debate.
My Lords, in following the noble Viscount Trenchard, food safety and food standards, I will get back to that in some detail, but I will have to point out to the noble Viscounts that the issues around chlorine-washed chicken are about the standards of production behind that forces the necessity of chlorine washing, and the dreadful US standards, which that's mostly referring to, of food safety is surely not something we want to import into the UK. Like other noble lords, I begin by thanking the noble Baroness Lady Hayter for her very clear introduction, and the committee for, I think, what is a very comprehensive report. It expresses many of the concerns that I share about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm going to use that as a term for ease of rather than acronym. Although I would put the expressions of concern in much stronger terms than the committee has, but we know that our committees operate on a consensus basis. Much of what I might have said about the fact that it makes much more sense to trade with our neighbours, the noble Lord Purvis has already said, so I won't repeat that. It's worth, I can cite one economics textbook that notes that the negative correlation between geographic distance and bilateral trade volumes is considered to be one of the most robust findings in economics. I don't often quote mainstream economics, but I think there's some obvious common sense there. I do hope the noble Lord Purvis of Tweed's neighbour's cat gets better soon, because it's a very useful metaphor, that one. And I'd also agree with what the noble Lord said about, in terms of a visit to Taiwan. I think it was a very useful comment. Now, what we're talking about with the Trans-Pacific Partnership is decisions that have significant ramifications for climate action and inaction, for the environmental standards, for human rights, for labour rights, international development, food standards, as I've already referred to, animal welfare and public health. One of the areas that's rightly received most attention around the Trans-Pacific Partnership has been the conclusion with Malaysia on palm oil. And this is a very significant major issue for environmental standards and Indigenous rights in Malaysia. And it's also, and we think, as your Lordship's House is increasingly debating ultra-processed food, an issue for public health in the UK as well. I think of some of the rising innovative producers in the UK of alternative oilseed crops and how difficult it can be for them to compete against palm oil produced from felled rainforest under very dubious labour conditions. I'm sure the noble Lord the Minister may say, oh, but it's all going to be sustainable, but I'm afraid the standards, the registration standards, simply don't stack up for much of Malaysian palm oil. I'd also raise an issue with the Minister that I'd be interested in a direct response, either now or in writing, about pesticides that are banned in the UK but are used across the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and what the government is doing to make sure that products treated with those pesticides are not brought into the UK. And I think it's also, just agreeing again with the noble Viscount Trenchard on the precautionary principle, the EU is bringing in stronger and stronger rules because they didn't apply the precautionary principle, and more research is showing more and more dangers, particularly from pesticides and other chemicals in use. The EU is getting far ahead of us in terms of banning chemicals. We are trailing far behind. There's a real risk that we can become a dumping ground for products that can't be sold in the EU under tightened EU regulations, but they get dumped on us. So what's the government doing to ensure that that doesn't happen? Now, I very much agree with the comments made by the noble Lord Kerr of Kinlochard about the democratic deficit, the giant democratic deficit that we have in the UK with regard to trade deals, as indeed the committee report also makes clear. All we have here is a take-note motion, a definition of not doing anything. That's exactly what we're doing now. All we can do is express concerns with no substantive impact. And here I come to, again, disagreeing, as I have many times before and probably many times will again with the Noble Lord Lansley on the issue of ISDS, which there is substantial evidence that not only does it in some cases force governments to reverse measures taken for the public good, it also has a chilling effect on democratic decision-making for the public good. And I note the UN Conference on Trade and Development. The most recent figures I've found is 175 cases that have been brought under environmental issues under the ISDS procedure. Now, I note that half of those were under the Energy Charter Treaty, and I will praise the government for its direction of travel on the Energy Charter Treaty. There is indeed progress there, so well done on that, but that still leaves the other half of the cases. And I think there is no doubt both on the impact of reducing government action, but also very importantly on the issues that I'm going to come to in terms of adverse effects on particularly the agri-food sector in the UK. And on that, I'm going to come to some very specific recent issues that mostly relate to the Australia trade deal, but of course that ties in with the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well. And there's been promises from the government that in terms of Canadian beef, that no hormone-treated Canadian beef is going to come in under this. What can the government... I'd be interested in the latest on what the government's doing on that. But I think it's really interesting to look at some recent developments with Australian beef. And Farmers Weekly has recently reported the first attempt, I think, under the new deal to export British beef to Australia, and it was stopped by Australian trade regulations. Now, I'm not, as a Green, in any favour whatsoever, for the avoidance of doubt, of us producing beef here and shipping it to Australia, and Australia producing beef there and shipping it here. But nonetheless, we are in a situation where there is a profound inequality between Australian farmers and British farmers in the trade arena. There also, of course, is a profound imbalance in terms of production costs and production systems between Australian beef and British beef. And I note, and I don't know if the Noble Lord the Minister is aware of this, a recent article published in Animal Production Science, which is a CSIRO publishing journal, was actually looking at greenhouse gas emissions. But it, quite astonishingly really when you think about it, makes a well-defended, and of course this is published in a peer-reviewed journal case, there are actually 10 million more head of cattle in the UK, Australia, than official counts provide for. Now, it's interesting when we look at the head of the ABS Australian Statistics Bureau said that actually the official figures were never designed to measure the total cattle population, and it's clear that they are actually a much lower estimate. And I think it's really worth noting. I've been trying to explain to your Lordship's House regularly how different Australian production standards are, and perhaps this sentence will help. This is a direct quote from Rob Walter, Head of Agricultural Statistics. Some of those properties in Northern Australia are the size of small European countries. For them to know how many cattle they have can be very difficult. Close quote. I'd invite members of your Lordship's House to think about perhaps a local small farmer they know with a few head of cattle on 100 or 200 acres, and to contrast those two production systems and what it's like when they're trying to compete against each other. So I'm going to wrap up by agreeing with the Noble Lord Lansley on the fact that it's probably too late for this government to produce a trade policy. It wouldn't be a very meaningful piece of paper to reduce at this point. But what I would say is that this is an issue which very much needs to be part of the debate in our next general election, to think about what kind of trade we want, what kind of trade, what volumes of trade is to our benefit for our food security, for our environmental security, for all of our futures. And I note that I was at the meeting of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Fair Trade this morning, and this is the 30th anniversary this year of the fair trade movement. And It's made some progress, limited progress, but we still have profound inequality in global trade. We still have global trade that is not providing us with food security in this age of shocks. And we need to think about the level of trade that's useful to us, trade that's for the public good, rather than a simple maximisation of private profit that comes at the cost of us all.
My Lords,